Hello and welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I'm here with Joel Carini. Joel, people who might not have heard of you, how would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am a aspiring philosopher and theologian, hailing from St. Louis, Missouri, right now in the U.S. And I'm working currently on a PhD in philosophy, so that might be my actual academic credential here at St. Louis University. And at the same time, I've begun to do some substacking for a broader audience at joelcarini.substack.com or The Natural Theologian. So that's what I'm doing. I've been writing on a variety of topics, but often at the intersection of philosophy and theology.
Great, yeah. So I kind of wanted to speak to you about some pieces you put out on your Substack recently, which is under the title "Why Not Theistic Evolution," and you've done a handful of parts to that, at least so far. As someone who actually finds the normal STEM sciences rather boring, I found them really engaging pieces to read.
Thank you.
Before we get into the meat of those essays, which I would encourage people to read, and I'll leave some links in the associated descriptions. I did want to talk to you about like the angle coming into this and whether you think it's relevant or important. But I just kind of wanted to ask you like about your faith. Like, how do you identify as a faith? Is it something you've sort of had your whole life, or?
Yeah, I've been brought up as a Christian, and I'm still a Christian to this day. And so this is one of those pieces where it's a matter of becoming more self-conscious about faith and having to wrestle with the intellectual questions it raises, given contemporary presuppositions in the sciences and philosophy and elsewhere that suggest that traditional supernaturalist Christian faith has a couple knocks against it, not to mention ethical knocks against it these days. And so that was one of the things I thought through beginning high school, even learning the different arguments for and against just evolution, intelligent design, creationism, and within traditional secular academia, there's a certain more narrow range of views on the subject. As you can imagine, within, say, just traditional Christian churches, there's a different narrow range of views. And so kind of trying to interact with both of those discussions in a fruitful way and ending up at a position that may satisfy neither, that's kind of been my goal. And that's the conclusions I've come to leave me still a Christian, not thinking, science has been the death knell for traditional Christianity. Not necessarily that it proves everything either, or that you can do a perfect sort of scientific apologetic for Christianity or any other religion, but to my best ability, I'm trying to just look at evidence and put the pieces together, both from science, philosophy, biblical and theological studies as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like what you're describing there, it sounds like the seeds for the thoughts you kind of lay out in these pieces it's not like a recent study of yours. It seems like those seeds were planted a long time ago, and it's something you've been contemplating for a while.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's probably why it fit together so well, because you had a long time to think about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's I haven't had that many opportunities to write on it, and academic, especially more secular academics, does not present opportunities to write on this subject with this range of views being in play. So,
so these are going to sound like some really broad questions, but I think it's interesting to see how people interpret them and also see kind of what your angle on is. But let's get philosophical and kind of dissect the question of your essays anyway. So, like, in your view, what is theism?
Theism would be that there is a supernatural, non-physical being who's the source and origin of all things. Something like that believed in the traditional monotheistic Abrahamic religions.
Mm.
There are people who stray from that to one degree or another, but something approximately like that, that's theism.
Yeah. Mm. And then, so in contrast to that, like, how would you define evolution? And more importantly, because I've seen this written some places, but I'm not sure what people like actually mean by it. But the term like neo-Darwinism, like what is that? Like,
yeah. So neo-Darwinism, I would take to be a particular theory of how evolution occurred, taking it that it did. So neo-Darwinism would particularly be the theory. Darwin would have put the theory as natural selection acting upon biological variations gives rise to the variety of species. Then the neo-Darwinian synthesis comes along after DNA has been discovered and variation can be updated to be genetic mutation. So now it's understood that biological organisms vary by their genome having different mutations to the genetic code. And so then you update the theory of evolution to be natural selection acting upon random mutations. And that's neo-Darwinism. And the theory would be that explains to a large degree the variety of biological kinds of organisms.
Sure, yeah. So basically, to take those two terms and put them together and kind of like create the term theistic evolution, which I say you're sort of advocating for in these writings. You're sort of combining that knowledge of I guess actually, to take your exact words, you put the belief in evolution with the belief in God. It's like sort of combining those two together. And I suppose one of your opening statements in the first part of this was that you want to incorporate scientific evidence into a Christian view. I'm just sort of wondering, like, these are all beliefs, right? Like, why does it matter? Why does it matter what form they take?
Why does it matter? Well, first of all, I just wanted to clarify. So theistic evolution is, combining of those two views together.
Yeah.
I'm arguing against that combination to a certain degree. So that's the way I'm putting it together. But why does it matter? Well, so there's interesting pieces on one side or the other. So often evolution is simply taken to be the sort of scientific license for atheism. So Richard Dawkins famously says, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Before that, somebody like David Hume tried, but he couldn't quite get over the argument from design. Yeah. Whereas Darwin sort of supplies the naturalistic, unguided mechanism to say we don't need a designer, we don't need a God. So evolution is often taken to be this sort of crucial step in secularization and saying that we don't need anything supernatural. Religion becomes at best superfluous, maybe an add-on to an otherwise naturalistic account of everything. So in one way, it matters to argue whether an account of biology exists that secures the whole naturalistic realm, the realm of nature, against supernatural intervention. Whether that can be done truly, that makes a difference to how the vast majority of us see the world. I mean, if it were just simply shown like evolution couldn't do this, and it were widely publicized, and elites in our society accepted that, people would return to belief in God to some degree, probably, or to a variety of neo-paganisms or something. But on the other hand, from the perspective that I've largely taken, which is of a Christian thinking through the scientific account of life, there's a question whether, as a Christian, I should sort of just leave the sciences alone and say, okay, I don't need to modify any of that. But by the way, there's also a God. He wasn't necessary to create everything, but maybe he's there. Versus an account that says a type of theology that sort of intervenes in the sciences a bit more and says, actually, the scientific account is flawed in certain ways, and different Christians and other religious believers have gone to different lengths in this, up to and including, say, flat earthism, to young Earth creationism, where we reject the standard cosmological and geological timeline, or simply intelligent design, which simply says that neo-Darwinian unguided mechanisms aren't sufficient to give rise to life as we see it. You need to appeal to an intelligent designer in some degree, in some way. Yeah. So I think these matter, not because there are people who put any variety of these claims together, and they live their lives, but for the sake of intellectual consistency and really thinking things through, it's a question: does the natural world suffice to explain itself, or does it require something more? And I think that's a question whether you're on a more atheistic, agnostic side or a more religious side. It has relevance in different ways.
Yeah, one really interesting thing you pointed out is that the explicit atheism, the Dawkins sort of side of things, is actually like a minority view if you really ask people, and that basically overrepresented in academia and popular culture. And then for I guess for dialectical reasons, the extreme creationist that completely rejects everything that comes out of science is also, in a way, I would argue, a minority view, and is definitely overrepresented in at least popular culture.
Yeah.
Usually it appeals.
Yeah, the framing just often is stuck that way, and you'll hear the evolutionists arguing against. I saw one video where it pitted the evolutionists against some flat earthers, and you're like, this is just stacked to be totally ridiculous and unhelpful. Yeah, as opposed to people who are really putting the pieces together in a non-conspiratorial way and just, trying to parse specific questions instead of, debunking the entire scientific perspective.
So I suppose moving through what you've written, the one of the kind of biggest focuses is kind of the contrast between a view of gradualism and great leaps. I suppose that kind of, in a way, condenses, at least on this specific evolution question, the sort of contrast between the very creationist view and very sort of Darwinistic view. Can you sort of outline for people who don't quite understand the language there what that means?
Yeah. So in order for a neo-Darwinian explanation of all things to fit the evidence, we need a certain number of things to work. I mean, for one, gradualism would be the claim that this all happened step by step, bit by bit. There would be a continuous series of biological forms from one kind to another, including things like a whale, which has kind of vestigial limbs coming from something that had functional limbs, and you'd have to have a transitional species at every step along the way, and you need the mechanism to explain things in that purely step-by-step way. There have been some theories of evolution that have some leaps in them, but generally, if there are gaps, then it's hard to imagine a naturalistic way of bridging those gaps or of crossing that. If every species showed up in the archaeological evidence just fully formed, and we couldn't come up with a mechanism that changed them gradually one into another, there wouldn't be a naturalistic, purely scientific explanation available. So one question is whether the fossil evidence supports that kind of continuous, gradual change, and what given certain mechanisms that we are aware of and can know because they can be operational today, that create incremental and gradual change to organisms, can those suffice to explain things at a certain scale and a certain variety between organisms? So as far as gradualism, that's what's going on there. Basically, to have a naturalistic explanation of everything, we need, just as you see an acorn grow into a tree without any gaps or leaps or some being intervening to get it from one to the other. The development of all of life has to have a similar pattern, often called the tree of life. So that's at least an answer to the question about gradualism.
Yeah. And I suppose one of the main parts you're kind of making there is that there are topological distinctions in the life we see on Earth. For example, there's a very clear category of like cat, which you say like a lynx or a house cat fits within. There's a very clear category of bird, and things there's not like a gradual progression between a cat and a bird, for example. I know it's oversimplifying it, but I think that.
Yeah, well, exactly. The basic challenge, and this is acknowledged by all, is that our current array of biological species is largely divided out into types without true transitional species existing today. I mean, even something like a platypus isn't really a great candidate to be a transition from, a rodent to a duck or something. It's a bizarre extra category of the duck-billed rodent. So the question then becomes really, is there evidence that these quite distinct types that we see today, with some exceptions, that there are definitely places where biological kinds are more similar to one another, but generally where we see distinct types today, can we find in the fossil evidence evidence of gradual transition, and or just enough gaps, even if we didn't find transitional species, reason to think that they must have been there and they just weren't fossilized, etc.
Right. And then, so I'm just kind of, as someone who's thought about determinism quite a lot, I'm just wondering what like kind of chance of like the place of chance is in all this, because like, why a creator and not just randomness or entropy?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and there are sort of different places you can focus in this discussion on evolution. There's the fossil evidence. There's things happening at the biochemical level and the genome, and there's a certain literature built up around that. And then there's really just the very basic mathematical and philosophical questions about probability and chance. And those ones are crucial and important. And they have a pedigree going back to Aristotle, which is something I try to point out in one of my pieces, that questions about, can chance explain the appearance of design, or can chance explain teleology, ordering to an end, all the parts of an organism like that of a mechanism being designed for a purpose, or at least functioning for a certain purpose. Can that be explained by chance alone? So I'll mention one indication that the odds of chance aren't so great, which is like with the whole literature on the fine-tuning of the physical laws of the universe, many leading biologists and physicists are reckoning with the minuscule probabilities of things coming about in an unguided way. So focused on biology, the one evolutionary biologist, Eugene Koonin, he roughly calculates at least some of the probabilities of life coming about, originating and spreading out in the way it has, at 1 in 10 to the 1,018th power, which is a summary way of saying a just ridiculously large number. It's 1 over, a 1 with 10,000 or 1,000 zeros after it. These probabilities, they lead him to things like the multiverse hypothesis, which is sort of wherein this is extremely improbable. You would need to sort of have a grab bag of gazillions of universes, have the same thing, try to develop by chance in each one of them, and then we just happen to be in the one where it did, which is really a lack of an explanation rather than an explanation. It's something like it's hard to make this exact comparison, but it's something like winning. I was going to say winning the lottery, and then it would be more like let me just go into that, because there are some difficulties there. So it is like winning the lottery. It's very rare. It's very improbable. Okay, so now improbable things happen all the time. Okay, so the exact arrangement of entities in this room, one chair could have been askew or something. It's entirely improbable that any given arrangement is what it is. But those things happen every day. Every day we're surrounded by things that are, by that standard, really improbable. But we start to suspect things like design when there's a sort of a pre-specified way of determining that layout. If there were another room across the hall from this one, there's like 4 chairs sitting in this room, and the 4 chairs in that room, you could measure down to the micrometer, and they were in exactly the same position. You'd say that couldn't happen by chance. And so, given that we can sort of specify the conditions we see in this universe as exactly those needed for life, and that's the fine-tuning piece. But then with biology, if you take something like a particular genome and all the possible combinations of A's, C's, T's, and G's that it could have been, the number of those that are biologically functional is just minuscule compared to the total possibilities. And so there we have a pre-specified way, namely whether it's biologically functional, to look at this result and say, this is hugely improbable. And to get an improbable result and then just say, oh, we must be in the one universe where that just happened randomly, that's not really an explanation at all. So there's some reasoning here about probability. And for that, I'd recommend William Dembski's work. He's a philosopher and mathematician in the kind of intelligent design group. And I think basic intuitions about probability really come into play here. So with probability, basically with Darwinism, we're asked to sort of believe that because it's physically possible that, say, we have to take really a non-biological example here, but you're driving down the highway, you see on a hillside a set of rocks that are arranged so to say, welcome to St. Louis. And it's physically possible that if a bunch of rocks fall, they should fall in any improbable position. That's bound to happen, and it's not physically impossible that it would be this position. But as soon as you start to do the actual calculation of this probability and the way that it's specified to a particular meaningful end, it would just be ridiculous to say that this happened by chance. And so I think a lot of the way we're sort of asked to believe in all of life coming about by chance is something like this, where, yes, it's physically possible that particles should arrange themselves, or mechanically possible, but that they should arrange themselves in a way that has order and function and purpose, that requires explanation. I was thinking this morning, it's mechanically possible, but really, you mentioned entropy. I mean, by the second law of thermodynamics, things do tend to disorder, and to have order, an explanation is called for, and we can delve into that kind of explanation and the different varieties of mechanisms that have been proposed, but they all run into this basic question of explaining order.
Yeah.
So,
is God extropy?
Is the word extropy, you said?
Is extropy God?
So define extropy. So entropy be things tending towards disorder. So this would be a sort of an outside source of order.
Not necessarily an outside force. I think it's fair to say we can observe entropy in our empirical universe, but for some reason, there is also forces of extropy, which I would be fair to say, again, from kind of like our sense data, empirical stuff, seems to be more rare, but still present in some cases. And I was just carry the point forward because I found that thread of thought there really interesting. I was trying to rail at home if you would, as a believing person, whether you would kind of connect the two completely and square the circle, maybe. Or
yeah. Well, I think there's sources of, say, spontaneous order, like a whirlpool, or the crystalline structure of a snowflake, or there's kinds of order that sort of spontaneously arise given other conditions. So at least with those examples, those arise from the nature of certain physical forces and certain elements in their structure. And so that order arises from the nature of things in a way that's driven basically by necessity. Now, the question that we're dealing with biology, there are probably several forms of order at a certain scale that fit more into the whirlpool or snowflake kind of category, but there are a lot of forms of ordering of different parts together that cannot be explained in that sort of spontaneous order, just because they have with each of those, the language here is difficult to find. They're ordered, they're complex, but there's also a kind of simplicity to them, a sort of repetitive kind of order, as opposed to parts that, say, in a given molecular machine, like the mitochondria or the bacterial flagellum, which is the sort of outboard motor on a bacteria. The different parts of this, there's nothing really spontaneous about it. The structure of it comes from the genetic code, which is perfectly programmed to create that thing. It's not the same as, say, if you had a certain protein, and each protein has a particular shape, and if you had 1,000 of that protein, they'd probably form in a sort of geometrical excuse me, spontaneous kind of order. But when you have the complexity of all these different proteins and they're following the programming of this genome, it's not that same kind of spontaneity. It's rather, in that case, it's truly pre-programmed, and the origin of that genetic programming to perform this particular biological function, that calls for a different kind of explanation. Which the alternatives are basically intelligent design or some sort of stepwise process to lead up to these things.
Yeah. What would you make of the statement, it's just as philosophically dogmatic to believe in the miracle of chance as it is to believe in the miracle of God? Keyword being philosophically, I suppose.
Yeah. So, I think there's a difference, and there's also the question of what can be proved from evidence of design in nature is a long-standing one, and usually philosophical arguments from design have tended to stop short of saying the specificity of God. Traditionally, natural theology of that kind, it specified certain attributes of a being that would have had to give rise to things, but not others. So the contemporary intelligent design movement basically says it's got to be intelligent, but it could be, though this just kicks the can down further, it could be an intelligence from within the world, but from another planet that seeded life on Earth, which even Richard Dawkins floated that at a certain point, sort of acknowledging that might be necessary. Of course, that just kicks the can down the road for how do you explain the origin of that other form of life. Excuse me. So,
and I'm sorry to interrupt there, but I feel like Dawkins putting out that sort of like, it's very often like a sci-fi idea that, you know, the origin of man is in like some alien race from outer space. And I feel like not on like necessarily like a philosophical level, but I feel like on a cultural level, that definitely shows that the zeitgeist of new atheism, whatever that was, is kind of clutching at straws at this point, you know?
I think it is. It's especially I think in fine tuning and the laws of physics, that's much more well recognized. And that's pushing a lot of people towards the multiverse and things like that, which again, I said, I don't think that's really an explanation, but they're basically an admission that there's a lot that's left unexplained. So the question with God, I was sort of trying to say that, you know, if I said you look at biology and you just have to be a Christian, well, that doesn't follow. There's a lot of leaps there, but the argument is that there does need to be an intelligent cause, which, you know, that's plenty. But the real question is whether that argument goes through. If it does, then that is the result. Whereas on the other hand, whether chance can explain all things, I think that's just a way of saying that there's a huge gap in our explanation, and we don't have an explanation. So that to me is just a gap, unless we really do have a mechanism that explains all things and is unguided. Then to just say that it is by chance, I think is often just guided by a methodological naturalist account of science. The idea that science just has to be a closed naturalistic sphere that explains everything. And if it's not, we've given up the task of science. So given that metaphysical and methodological assumption, chance has to explain, but the question whether it really does is an open one.
Right, yeah. Another thing I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit is that at least on the edges of empirical science, there is now in the 21st century, and I suppose arguably that this was burgeoning in the 20th, is that there are becoming possibilities for humanity to sort of drive the biological process, to start, editing genetic code, whatever that is, whatever the origin of that is. There is a sense in which I suppose you might argue that this process has been guided by intelligence. Is probably I think that's not taking words out of your mouth the way you put it, but that humanity is going to kind of start to be in the driving seat. Do you think that's going to, like, this is getting off the topic of your original essays, but I think it's an interesting question. Do you think that's going to be a positive thing, or do you think that that is going to be a kind of negative thing?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on that are largely from a different source, of the sense that that is playing God in a certain way and is ethically questionable. So I think there are also just limitations on what can be done, which, we'll figure out what those limits are, unfortunately. But I mean, to some extent, eugenics was obviously one attempt to do this. That's basically artificial selection using human beings, and that's possible to do. And maybe it's possible to not do eugenics with its negative connotations if you're directly editing genomes and directing and guiding things. I mean, there might be ethically non-objectionable versions of this, just keying in on certain genetic defects or beneficial mutations. That's possible. I'm sort of open to seeing how those things are done, but I do have a just kind of that ethical worry that I would cite something like the story of the Tower of Babel biblically. Where
let's get into the weeds on this, because I think it's interesting.
Sure.
I mean, at least to just identify myself, I don't explicitly identify myself as a religion, but part of my writings and part of my theory is that humans just inherently think in religious ways. Going back to the Dawkins stuff is where they have liberated themselves from the belief in God. They suddenly believe in super space intelligence. This thinking comes back into things, and there are there's evidence of people taking medical science and making that their new theology, and that's going to be the liberation sort of stuff. I think it's kind of interesting because I think, and again, if I'm taking words in your mouth and I'm characterizing you or your side the wrong way, that's fine. Just interrupt me on that. But I think that, and this is probably getting down to like human temperaments and stuff like that, but I feel like people on the creationist side of things, on the faith side of things, or at least the traditional faith side of things, sort of possibly fall afoul of some sort of philosophical fallacy when they see, things are this extropic force that we've described, this intelligence is a certain way, it structures cells in a certain way, it has structured nature in a certain way, it has structured humanity in a certain way, and then should inherently not be tampered with. And I suppose the fallacy I would say sort of falls short of is that, well, in that argument, humanity is an extension of that intelligence. And if anything, like you could make a theistic argument to say that, and as it says in scriptures that, or at least implies in the scriptures that man's dominion is over the animals, perhaps man's dominion is over nature.
Yeah, so I think there are there can be a version of this that basically says, let's take the divide between kind of the natural and the artificial, and it basically says everything that humans do is wrong, tampering with nature. There'd be a sort of theistic environmental philosophy that could arise from this, that just sees human interference with nature as purely negative. And medical intervention, there are Christian theistic advocates of, say, holistic medicine that want to not do any medical technology that intervenes even in ways that most of us have come to accept. Somebody could say I shouldn't wear glasses and I should just use my natural eyes as they are. So there's a version of that argument that definitely is incorrect. I mean, human nature is, first of all, we have to recognize that human beings are part of nature. And so when we build a bridge or chop down a tree, I mean, that's a natural process. It's not, some versions say on the environmental left perhaps almost view human beings as not part of nature. And that's why anything they do is wrong interference. So that's not going to work. So human beings are part of nature. We can and should intervene and interact in nature. I mean, gardening is a basic version of this. It's designed for the good of nature.
The scriptures as well, right?
Yeah, that's
the dominion over nature, right? Like it's a part of like
and that primitive version of the walled garden, as somebody like Jordan Peterson would talk about, that image of nature cultivated. That's the ideal for human nature. So the question is whether there's a version of human interaction and intervention in nature that is categorically distinct. And here, I'd follow something like Heidegger's essay on technology, where he talks about, he believes a categorical difference between, say, a windmill that's powered by a river, or the windmill would be powered by the wind, but say a water mill that's powered by a river, and there's been a human intervention that sort of harnesses nature, but doesn't really interfere with it. And then he compares that to a hydropower plant that's totally damming up the Rhine and extracting power from it that it will be saved for future use. And he draws a categorical distinction, arguing that the latter is of a piece with this whole sort of tyranny over nature that modern scientific technology ultimately brings about. And that would be that. So there's a non-Christian, non-theological source for that worry, and many continental philosophers have taken that up. Many environmentalists, but also Christian philosophers, someone like Paul Kingsnorth, or and I've written a little bit on that as well. So I think there's some sort of divide there, and the question where it is, we know that people of faith can be tempted to draw that line too soon. But, my allegation would be that there's a purely secular and utilitarian perspective that gets rid of everything that's sacred. And any of these lines, I think this is how the stem cell debate, some of these other ones end up happening. They're on an ethical perspective, like a Christian one that has room for a sense of the sacred. There are going to be some things that might even be beneficial to humanity in certain ways, but we just can't go there. And I would think that there are or have to be some such limits.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, like I said, as not a professing something explicit here, I would go further and say like there's non-rationalistic reasons to not to do and not do things, and to the extent where it almost has, for me at least, in my ethical intuitions, like an aesthetic quality. I think the idea of the Heideggerian idea of the watermill, that in comparison with a massive dam, is quite interesting, because the watermill is like non-rationalistic, is like aesthetically pleasing from a European context, which I think Heidegger is definitely talking from. It fits with the ethnos and culture of the place where it is, whereas the dam which blocks the Rhine is this huge alien object. It's almost like there's no explicit reason why we shouldn't create babies with two heads, but it feels wrong. Like from a human supremacist angle, which I definitely identify as, I feel like I'm a human supremacist for humans in their original form with the one head.
Yeah. Well, and I do think there's a question there too of do we have a nature, and does it kind of limit the allowable changes? And I think this is something that shows up back in the evolution discussion, but also here. I mean, if you create a two-headed human, that's just invariably a biological defect. There's often the fully evolutionary perspective has to deny the distinction between variation and defect. So one of the arguments that I consider in my series is this argument by Michael Behe that variation and biological change does occur, but it occurs in this way that is devolutionary. An organism can change, but it's by a loss of genetic information, which accidentally can be beneficial in certain circumstances. If you have one gene of the sickle cell mutation, you won't get the anemia, but you will be protected against malaria. So that's a beneficial mutation, but it is the sickle cell mutation itself is potentially damaging and damaging to the original sort of human genetic code. So, I mean, I think this has applications both for the arguments about evolution. You can have variations on a nature, but they tend towards disorder and breakdown. But what you lack is an explanation of the origin of this functional genetic code and the nature of the thing, which determines the limits of how much it can change. A certain amount of biological change to an organism, and it will just break down.
Yeah. One thing that came to my mind, and I kind of wanted to see what your thoughts on this kind of out of left field idea on what you wrote is that I'm wondering what I haven't asked you about your how you identify denominationally, but I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on Christian denominations in general, whether you're someone who thinks very strongly that there is one true one and very many heretical variations, or whether you've got a bit of a softer view where say, oh, they're kind of, you're all brothers, right? But one thing that came to my mind is that, all the different denominations are almost like corruptions in the same way that you describe evolutions almost. And I'm sort of wondering if whether, you would extend the biological point to intellectual or, like organizational patterns of humanity as well, whether you think that, all the variations of Christianity, all the variations of maybe even religion are actually something guided by God himself.
Good question. Yeah. So couple points. So I'll just start with the denomination. So I've been different places on this question. So on one level, in a lot of America, there are churches that are called non-denominational, and these churches are completely independent of one another organizationally, and often entirely identical to one another because they're copying the same playbook. So, I mean, really, we could think of the American megachurch as almost its own denomination, just unofficially. But so that shows me that churches do end up copying one another, and there's no reason not to recognize which variety you are. At the same time, I think when I compare it to being utterly non-denominational, any denomination is a group of Christians expressing a kind of religious unity, which is good. So instead of thinking of each denomination as, wow, so divisive compared to the others, well, imagine it as an attempt at unity across a number of
and correct me if I'm wrong, the original meaning of the word church is a unity, like a whole, right? Or am I completely wrong on that? I might be wrong on that.
Well, the etymology I know would be from the Greek word ecclesia, a group that's been called out. So it doesn't really say that question of unity. Yeah. But the word Catholic does mean.
That might be what I'm mixing up. Okay.
It means universal, but it has that sense of it's the whole. So, but to really get further into your question, I try to take what I call a small c Catholic position. So I'm not a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox. I would dispute their claims to be, the one true church. I actually think that's not Catholic in the original sense. Catholic Christianity was supposed to be, you can recognize anywhere somebody who holds the same faith. It's the same Orthodox Christian faith. Orthodox with a small o, meaning a certain body of doctrine that everyone who's a Christian believes there's salvation through this one man who was God. So to me, that can be recognized across denominations, and any claim to be the one true church sort of cuts against that church unity. So, I mean, ideally, you would have one institution. At one point in the history of the Christian church, there was one institution, but I mean, almost by inevitable forces, it's broken apart and there have been split offs. But no, I'm more of the view that this one Christian faith can be found in people of all denominations. And then, there's the question whether, being a Christian, you take it that there is one way of salvation through Jesus Christ. Whatever that means, faith in his death and so on. But it's not directly therefore impossible that anyone who didn't explicitly hold that might implicitly be saved by that means. And people like C.S. Lewis, Karl Rahner, others have proposed this.
Yeah.
And so I would dispute the idea that all religions are just the same, but that there might be those who are saved who are seeking ultimately Christ, but outside of the bounds of the church. That's possible, though. And also, I would say my study of philosophy has really led me to think there are ways of expressing what is common and what unites all faiths. And often it's more philosophical claims, right. Like in Buddhism, you get that life is suffering. In Greek philosophy, you get that life is tragic. In the Christian faith, that's the doctrine of original sin and the fall. And so there can be these universal truths which people recognize, and that sort of leads them towards the true faith. And in fact, I think the important thing then too is that there are people who profess Christian faith but are not really walking the walk of righteousness, let's say. Yeah. And they would map onto the Pharisees, who Jesus spent most of his time critiquing, the very religious people who were outwardly religious. In Christian terms, they would have, said, I'm a Christian, yeah. But the sort of spiritual reality wasn't there. So I think once you're open to that gap, then the idea that the people who say they're Christians are really the Christians, and the people who don't say they're Christians are necessarily out, that requires some modification.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever go through, I guess, a phase of doubt, or maybe even more extreme, an atheist phase? And if so, why? And if not, why not? You can give us simple answer you want for that one.
Well, the simple answer is no. I've always been a Christian in the sense of like believing the doctrines. Why and how, how can you defend or prove certain supernatural events that allegedly happened thousands of years ago? Yeah, that's challenging, but there's the way in which that's believed. I mean, it has a grip. It has a grip on someone. And then for me, I've always had the sense that Christianity is tied to a sort of moral core. And if I gave up Christian faith, I would sort of have a license to go do certain things that I don't think I should be doing.
Mm.
And so I don't really, while I believe that there are people who aren't Christians who are good and are, doing various good things, I know that for me, if I abandoned it, among other things, I'd feel a license to, go look up as much porn as I wanted, for example, as just a very moralistic one. The sense that my appetites and desires must be restrained, and that if I gave up my religious faith, that restraint would sort of disappear. Maybe I could cobble it back together with some self-help literature on, how it's genetically, or it's bad for your brain to be on porn, which I've heard that stuff, and I think that's good. But
yeah,
I've never trusted myself that, I'd honestly be just pursuing truth if I were to give up Christian faith. And a lot of these reflections on, what's often just called apologetics, thinking about arguments for God's existence and, the history around the resurrection. Did the disciples just make this whole thing up, etc.? I mean, we can't go back with a video camera and check the thing for sure, but I've just explored these questions. My belief has been bolstered, and so but I think what's important there is a lot of people talk about doubt as a way of sort of examining their faith, and I've done that sort of examining to a great degree. That's why I've gone into degrees in theology and philosophy. But unlike some others, I find faith bolstered by those things.
Yeah. What I find really interesting there, and I think it speaks to something I call downstream metaphysics, where although, I mean, especially philosophically, these are things are, in a way, they're ideas. But if people believe in something metaphysically, it has like a downstream effect on the way they act ethically and the way the physical world plays itself out with the humans in it, basically, which is really interesting. And what I find interesting is most people view doubt as, oh, I'm not sure if Jesus Christ was the Son of God, but it almost sounds like, and I think your view on it might be more enlightening that to people who don't believe, is that your doubt is almost a doubt in the human animal as opposed to a doubt in those metaphysical things.
Yeah. The sense that moral sense.
Because why place your faith in the appetites of the human animal by itself?
Yeah. There's a sense of the inadequacy of just human beings on our own. That's why I mentioned, like, people say that they can be good without God, but I would have a huge reason to be good missing if I didn't think we were accountable to someone for our actions. And I mean, the how you can prove the massive leap between a naturalistic worldview and one where there's a God, that's tough. But the fact that would make a huge difference in life, I think, is undeniable. I mean, I think about, Jordan Peterson saying, I act as though I believe in God, and I'm terrified that there might be a God, something like that. And that, he wouldn't say he believes in God unless he lived the life to back that up, because that would really require something of one's life. For me, it's kind of the other direction, because I'm coming from the other angle, but a sense that to give this up would be to say that to me it would lead to nihilism. I'd like to think that if I weren't a Christian, I would be the Jordan Peterson or the Douglas Murray who sees the utility in religion and has the whole sophisticated way of looking at things. But at the end of the day, if this stuff weren't real, to my mind, it is matter in motion, and there's no real purpose, and there's no ultimate reason why I need to live an ethically upright life.
Yeah.
That's a bit black or white, but at the end of the day, I feel like those are potentially the stakes.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting place to leave it. And I think this conversation has been pretty deep and not for the reasons I expected. So hopefully it'll be the first of many that we'll have. But I do think that's a good place to leave it. I mean, just what I do with everyone who I speak to for the first time, just as a reminder, not to be so deep, not to be so serious about everything, as I do ask them one question at the end, which is, Joel, if you were on death row, or maybe you're about to be martyred for your faith, what was your last meal?
My last meal?
Yeah, your last meal.
It would be some tasty orange chicken.
Awesome.
Nice bowl of greasy Asian food. That would be the stuff.